7 a.m. We love what we do.
Yes.
It is morning time, 7 a.m., and it is March 16th, and we are launching a new Arrays of Living series called Connect to Thrive Morning Reflections. And I will be co hosting this with Theano Evagelou. Morning, Theano.
Good morning. Good morning. Great to be here.
It is fantastic. So I'm so excited for this. The show is all about sex, love, and relationship, and no topic is too much of a topic for this show. It will kickstart your mornings, kickstart your pleasure points, and hopefully you will join in with us and watch. Today's show is the pleasure prescription. And we are going to be talking about any and everything related to pleasure and how you get, as per pleasure, the meaning is enjoyment and satisfaction. So literally, how do you get enjoyment and satisfaction from within your life and within your relationships? So with that, I think our first point of topic is going to be talking about some of the things in our body that gives us that feeling of pleasure, which is serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. So, Theano, take it from there.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first off, I want to just even introduce the topic of pleasure because there's a tendency in our culture to dismiss it and say, why bother? And it's imperative, people are like, well, let's put everyone's pleasure before our own. And this is a huge block, especially for many women, especially around the fact of meeting their own needs for pleasure is considered a quote, waste of time, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about pleasure, especially in Tantra, it's, we want to go beyond the theory of what it is and really get into the tools that help us shift consciousness. Okay. So in the Tantra, the authentic Tantra modality that I work with my clients, there's a few practices that we use. And the first one is identifying the forms of pleasure. So we have physical pleasure, and this is like our relation to our senses, sight, smell, taste, feel, and and sound. Right? Did I say them all?
Yes, you did.
Like in really tuning in and being more in relation to these parts. Then there's our emotional pleasure. When we actually stepping into feeling good and really tuning into those joyful emotions and turning them up. There's our spiritual pleasure. Mm-hmm. And this is when we're in yoga or even out in nature or just connecting to something higher than ourselves. And then our sexual pleasure. And this is like when we are in sexual pleasure and we're experiencing orgasmic states, we're actually turning the whole brain online. So this is like specifically when you talk about all the different chemicals that we're turning on, right? Like there's just so, the dopamine, the serotonin, the oxytocin, so many chemicals that actually just get turned on and amplified. Like I believe, I'm just trying to look in my notes here. It's like 300 times more, like when we're actually in higher states of pleasure. Like the chemical release is actually 300 times more than any drug or anything that you can actually mm-hmm. take, right? So our ability to be medicine for ourselves is really profound.
And there's two aspects that I want to kind of delve into. And the other thing I want to make sure people, because I had interviewed you on an Arrays of Living show. So I want to make this very clear. This is not an interview show. This is a co-host show. So I do want to make that really clear. So I don't want to feel like, or have you feel like I'm interviewing you, but I am curious about one thing that you said. You had indicated that we tend to dismiss pleasure. And I kind of leaned my head because I leaned my head because I pondered if we dismiss it or we give up our pleasure for other people's pleasure, meaning even during in a partnering situation, sometimes we lower what we need to, in for the other partner, and not really equalize that or balance that. So is it that we dismiss pleasure? Is dismiss the right word to say we dismiss pleasure?
Well,
Or we're just kind of putting more emphasis, like 80% on other people, and leaving very little for ourselves, or nothing sometimes at all?
well, it's interesting. I think different people experience, I think it all happens. Like there's people that dismiss it. There's people that just put others' pleasure before their own,
Right.
whether it's conditioning, culture, societal.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's people's shame around pleasure. Like we're not taught that pleasure is just a birthright. We come into this world with bliss and pleasure and joy. And then it's kind of like we go through this world of our experiences and natural traumas. And then it's like we get to a stage where we're kind of looking for our way back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like to be like, oh, it's okay. And I'm allowed. And this is where it's really important to come back into changing that consciousness state, because we, as humans, we have a tendency to go towards the negative, to look at, the things that are just more challenging, to just really allow, right? Give permission to, right? And allow ourselves to experience the full medicine that pleasure can be, right? So, and trust me, in this conversation, I love it being dialogue, because there's so many things that come out when people, you're just on these topics of conversation with people. And it just, when you start just opening the lens of how different perceptions of how people see and experience different topics around sexuality, intimacy, pleasure, it's really profound at what you actually expand into and uncover just through the conversation. So it's welcome. So when in continuing to expand the definition of pleasure, and we talked about these 4 areas now, the second tool, is just that I like to offer the audience is one that I call the 10 spot. So just like we talked about expanding pleasure just through these different forms, 10 spot is about expanding now the depth of our pleasure experience. So when we're making dinner or having sex, we have an opportunity to experience, we want to have the opportunity to experience the most pleasure possible, right? So it's like, how do we do that? And that comes down again to mindfulness, right? So we're noticing on a scale from 1 to 10, what is your pleasure in the present moment? What would bring you closer to a 10, right? So a simple thing that I invite people to do is, notice throughout the day, or set an alarm, at random points, to just get attuned to evaluate this, right? And look at, where are you now? And is there anything other, and if it's anything other than a 10, you're asking yourself, like, what's going to bring me closer? When we actually start asking this question, we start noticing, am I allowed to swear on here? Because I'm just
no, on this show you can swear, just don't go excessive, because then I gotta, when I'm posting it, I gotta say it's censored. Yeah. But trust me, there's so many people that no, you're fine.
I'm just gonna say, when we actually start attuning ourselves, we notice where we're fucking through life, right? Like we're just going through autopilot, and and where we're settling, like you'll notice, oh my God, I'm at a 5 or 6 here all the time, or especially in this area. And then when we actually invite, what would it look like to be closer to a 10? We're talking about some profound transformation in the simplest of things, right? So, examples of that would be like, you're reading a book and you want a cozy blanket to feel warmer. You're having sex and it's like, and you feel uncomfortable, and you invite your partner to slow down or to shift positions, all to bring more pleasure. And these are like, it becomes medicine, right? So that's what I want to offer with that one. Do you, any comments? What does that leave you with? What comes up for you around that tool, that exercise?
From when you were speaking, I kept wondering if the audience would have a hard time distinguishing between pleasure and happiness.
Okay. So tell me.
And that kind of what resonated with me is that some of the things, some people will say I had a happy moment, or this made me happy. But what's that? Do you see a distinction there, or is it just me in terms of that could be a bit confusing for some people? That
when you're
pleasure
telling
piece and the happiness piece.
Yeah, no, when you're telling me about happiness, I'm seeing that as an emotional pleasure.
Interesting. Okay.
So when we're looking so pleasure, we talked about, consists of many forms. Right? And it's our birthright. It's that joy. It's that bliss. It's like an embodied state. It's a consciousness, right? But when I'm like, oh, I'm happy. Okay, wonderful. I see that as a component of emotional pleasure, right? Versus physical pleasure. Like when I'm like, okay, I'm out in nature and I smell the air, and there's just this visceral, just I don't know, like for me, it's just, there's this state that I'm just like, I could smell the air. I smell spring. I smell the flower. And there's just this, almost like I'm going to say a slight turn on in my body. Like something lights up a little bit. When you're talking to someone and you haven't spoken to in a while, or you're just in this beautiful conversation. And again, that little turn on, but like you're lit up to be in that moment, right? You're already starting to elevate pleasure plateaus. So it's kind of like, I'm going to say it like this. I see it as in sex, you actually physically, I guess you're more aware of your pleasure increasing, orgasming and coming back down. But in life, we have these pleasure plateaus as well.
Right.
So when you're experiencing these little things, that you're actually creating, shifts of consciousness, shifts in your chemical composition, in your brain transmitters as well. So they're just at different states. And the more you attune to them, the more you're actually starting to turn them up. So you start.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was in a session all weekend that also brought up the different hormones and all of that. And I'll give you a simple example so we can discuss it. I love nature. I love going out in nature. I can't wait for the weather so I can go for my walks. And I have this beautiful canal that I walk by, and I just have a great time, especially if I take my daughter's dog with me. I have a great time just walking, exploring, enjoying the nature, pausing. Sometimes I'll take something, I'll read, sit on a bench, read, and walk and make sure I do my long walk back home. When I come back, I don't say that was a pleasure moment. I say this is where I'm saying the distinction thing, that I just had a really great day. And it was such an amazing moment. And I link it with a happy moment as opposed to a pleasure moment. What I'm saying is I'm not necessarily, I don't know if in everyday things, and I love the way you said, yes, we heightened our pleasure in those things. I'm not sure everybody thinks of it that way. That's all I was saying.
And that's part of the education. Like even when you're having sex, it's not like you're saying, oh, that was pleasurable, right? Like you're like, that's a good fuck, or like I had a great time, right? But you're still experiencing the chemical, expansion, the release, getting the brain online. Like
absolutely.
When you start being able to just have the education to transform, right? I'm going to say the lens that you're experiencing life, like you start living turned on to life, right? When I'm sipping that coffee or that latte, and I'm taking in the smell and feeling the warmth on my hands of the cup and really just bringing it to my lips and just making it a pleasurable experience because I'm taking my time,
I
right?
love that. I love like I always have my cup of tea.
Well, and if you think this is so good and oh my
Yeah.
God, like this is hitting the spot, but you're like, wow, this is at some level, there's a slight turn on to that
Hmm.
experience, right? And it's just like, wow, like this is giving me great pleasure to enjoy it this way. Being out in nature, like if you're like, wow, like I feel the sun beating on me and, just like looking at life of nature,
Yeah.
really taking it in and you're like, wow, there's so much delight in understanding I'm a part of this. Like
Yeah, exactly.
you're just really connecting. And what you're also doing is you're relaxing the nervous system. So when you relax the nervous system, because when we're in constant contraction,
Hmm.
like in this world we live in, it's like there's always something coming at us or something to do or something to, take care of. So when we have these moments and we're training ourselves to just relax the nervous system, be in a state of ease and openness, that is what actually expands our capacity for pleasure. So when you're training it outside of the bedroom, when you start bringing it into the bedroom, you're actually having deeper experiences, expanded states that you're now translating. So it's all training, but we're using life to train us to have more profound sexual.
And I'm definitely all about all about living your life fully. So it's interesting, and it gives a different perspective, especially when you I all the moments you talk about I enjoy, like a good glass of wine, you know what I mean, curled up and just enjoy this amazing movie or something like that, right? Those
Mhm.
are all life pleasures and things. And now you give me a new lens to look at it, because as I said, I certainly have always looked at them as more happy moments, contentment moments,
Mhm.
I've never looked at it as to the pleasure scale, where it is on the pleasure scale. Can I tell you those are things I enjoy? Absolutely. Right? Sometimes even just going in and browsing, something I miss dearly actually, is going in and just say browsing a store, right? And touching different textures of material as you browse.
Oh,
So
right.
you know what I mean? And you can tell this is silky, this is um
Fluffy.
yeah, fluffy or coarse, or
Yeah.
just those types of touch things. To me, they were things I enjoy because I love putting colors and clothing together
Well,
and
and
dressing
so
women. So those were things I enjoyed. But now I'm going to look at them as I go through that. What you're asking, and I'm even like talking to the audience to try this if they're like me, didn't really connect those dots, is to go now and try it, but think of it from a pleasure perspective to say, what scale of pleasure would this be? A five, a six? What's that pleasure that you're getting out of that? I've
Mhm.
never looked at it that way.
Well, our experience to life is a constant, like, reaction, right?
Hmm.
Pain or pleasure. Like, it's so easy as for to stay in the scale of, "Oh, what's on the p on out of 1 to 10, what's your pain?" People relate to that, no problem, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But then you're like, "Okay, well, what if we actually bring that scale to pleasure?" Like, just like you're saying when you're touching all these fabrics and you're perusing in the store, you are actually creating a stimulus reaction, right? When you touch, you're like, oh, that feels smooth. Oh, that's prickly. Oh, that's cold. That's hot. Like you're having a visceral experience
Hmm.
and it's a stimulus. So either it's going to be a pain stimulus or a pleasure stimulus. And now you're able to just, be more in a relationship and intimate, like with that, to be like, I get to actually decide and I get to actually tune in and be in connection to w- that pleasure wisdom, right?
Right.
And you start living with life, like I call it opulent living. It's not about all you have and what you're getting.
Oh gosh,
It's
no.
how it's how you're experiencing life, right? You're in
Hmm.
it's rich, it's more vibrant, it becomes more colorful, it becomes more connected. Like life is going to be what it's going to be for all of us. We're here to have a human experience. But how we
Absolutely.
choose to interpret those experiences, and the more we focus on training ourselves to live in expanded states of pleasure, or even accepting sometimes when it's not a 10, but being like, we're not always going to be a 10. And that's part of reality. But when I'm a 4 or 5, can I find the pleasure in the 4 or 5 with where I'm at as well, right? There's places where we can choose it and make a modification, and there's other places where I can't. But you're in a place of choice to say, I can enjoy this at a 5 or 10 and know that's what it is, because it's out of my control, let's say, right? Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. And I think it's actually quite freeing to start to, as you said, it's like awareness, right? So it's becoming aware to be then able to put it into your focus and start to kind of experience it and explore it and just see what it is for you individually. And go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and you'll notice how the smallest things actually can change begin to changing your whole state, right? So that's the beauty of it.
It is beautiful.
Yeah. So the next tool, can we move on, or is there anything?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other tool I wanted to share with everyone is a pleasure journal. So now, as you're getting more attuned to how you're experiencing life, asking yourself these questions daily, or, journaling about them if you like to journal. What do I appreciate about my life? 3 things I appreciate about my life. 3 things I appreciate about myself. And then what are 3 ways that my needs for pleasure were met today? And when you start writing these things down, again, you're conditioning, you're shifting consciousness, right? And you're taking ourselves out of negativity and constantly bringing ourselves back, right? So when we're on a spiritual path, gratitude is a very important part of it, right? So we're rewiring the negative bias. When we're going into 3 things I appreciate about myself, this depends on self-connection, but we're beginning to love and accept who we are now, right? Bringing up, like, we're allowing the stuff to be brought up versus who I am, right? And then when we talk about the way our needs for pleasure were met in that day, we can relate these to the qualities that I talked about the first tool when we're identifying, is this a physical pleasure? Is this an emotional pleasure? Is this, a spiritual pleasure or a sexual pleasure? So now it's like, okay, here are the ways my needs for pleasure were met today. I'm noticing they're all emotional, or I'm noticing, hey, over the past little while, like, my physical needs of pleasure are very high and my sexual, let's say, is very low, right? So you just start noticing where your patterns are and where you might need to invest more time or attention, or invite something else in. Like, how can I bring more of this into my life? Because I notice this is an area really lacking, right? So that's that piece there. And
well, I'm all about journaling. I'm always talking about it. We need to journal. I journal as well. And I'm very reflective. The only piece I have never really, I don't think I've ever documented like 3 ways that your pleasure was met today. I've never documented that. I'm being very honest, as I always am. But that's not something that's in my journal.
Yeah, and you've got it a lot, like,
Yeah.
The other thing I want to make a distinction of is, like, usually I invite people to talk about appreciations more than gratitude, because sometimes things are happening in life I can't be grateful for, but I can appreciate them.
Oh, absolutely. I do see those things very distinct. Yeah, for sure. And I hope the audience can see the distinction between appreciation versus gratitude. So
well, it's like,
they can.
Look, I'll give an extreme example. Like, you go to jail for a reason or something like that. You're not going to be grateful for being in jail,
Exactly.
but you might be able to appreciate the experience it gave you to be where you are now, right?
Right.
So
Absolutely.
so sometimes even our most difficult moments can be things that we find appreciation.
They are the head ones you should appreciate because they were done to give you a learning or a lesson. So coming out, you should appreciate it. And if you don't appreciate it, more than likely you're going to relive it
Yeah,
in some other shape, but it'll be another tough situation, right?
totally, totally. Yeah, and like it's just understanding pleasure as medicine in our world. It's actually revolutionary. It's not something that people see easily or even identify with. So it's a beautiful conversation to have ongoing and just really open that space for people to invite it in.
And I'm like, it's not taught.
No.
Like, let's face it, it's not taught. And if you're brought up in a conservative household, for
Mhm.
sure it's not taught.
Yeah.
Right. And even sometimes, so that's why I said we throw around other words without really focusing on the pleasure piece.
Yeah.
And we're not teaching people how to measure, how to look at, how to discuss. So it's usually self-taught or taught with that you've encountered somebody that gets you more aware of it. No different to how I encounter you, and you make me more aware of those types of things to say, just go one grain deeper, Jen, and look at that now, right?
Yeah.
Because I definitely, that's not in my culture. We're not gonna they're not gonna talk about that. I'm more open with my kids to talk, have these kinds of conversations for sure. But so it's, I think the audience has to be aware of that. This is not taught. So we have to teach ourselves. And the first thing is with the awareness and practice in certain things. Start small,
Mhm.
right? Baby steps, and then expand from there to really try and raise up their awareness of pleasure and monitoring it, documenting it, and understanding the four areas, the four forms of pleasure.
And also even looking at sexual pleasure, like it's regenerative and healthy. Like as I said before, it provides the highest volume of chemicals in our body when we're
Mm-hmm.
in extensive periods of pleasure. And as I said before, that generates like up to a 300% increase. So the fact that sexual pleasure generates this much goodness is phenomenal, really.
Mm-hmm.
And the antidote to the religious and spiritual conditions that something is wrong with sexuality or just for procreation, because it's truly a path of longevity when we actually are investing it with an intent and consciousness and from a right place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's just many beautiful pieces in all of that.
It sounds beautiful. And I, yeah, and I, I think people get that there's a beauty in it. I
Mhm.
just don't know if everyone, especially as I said, depending on their upbringing, depending on their circumstances, have been given the freedom to really understand that it can be more, and it could be daily, and it can be managed. you know those are the pieces I don't think are given in society quite easily, unless you seek it out, unless you
No, and
have these kind of conversations that we're having.
look in the spectrum that's out there of what people are exposed to in terms of sex, it's very threatening, it's scary, and it's not um, taken into the context of it being medicine and healing and healthy. Like when you're working with conscious expanded states of pleasure and orgasm, you're teaching your body you're training the nervous system to handle that amount of energy, of pleasure in the nervous system, and it turns the whole brain online. It actually becomes a reboot for the entire consciousness, expanding your awareness. So you even get into the beta and theta waves, of all this, which um, what ends up happening is you're actually healing trauma, like you're creating new neural pathways to
Mhm.
pleasure and dissolving the ones that have been trauma, right? When you're doing this with healthy conscious intent, right? It's not about, hey, let's just go, oh my gosh, sex is great, let's just go do that. Yes, you can have some benefits in that, but it's what you bring into it in terms of the intention and the consciousness of the experience. Because you're exchanging energies, you're building energies, there's a responsibility around those energies. So honoring that whole experience and educating people that there's a path that can be healing and beautiful and sacred is something that I wish every person coming into their space of sexuality in that space, got taught, because I think it's an educational piece that allows them just to be more informed of what's possible.
And I'm going to ask a question, and you let me know if it's a crazy question. I don't know, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is the intent and going into it with intent? And I love how you said that. Is that the difference between, say, sexual experience that is addictive? Is the intent what separates those two things? Meaning you can have sexual experiences often, but if it's from an experiential intent perspective, is the what is, you know what I mean? Like, what's the difference between one that's doing it and is addicted to it?
Yes.
Versus one that is doing it with intention to experience, grow, heal, all those sort of things. What is there a difference or not?
Totally. Like there's, that space where I'm addicted, I need it because when, you're dealing with a root poison of attachment in that, like where I need something outside of me to know me, and I'm constantly chasing that, right? And then it's also like I'm going to say a stress response, because you're detaching, like you're trying to avoid the pain or trauma that's existing within you by chasing pleasure, like moments. So the intent isn't about present moment awareness, consciousness. It's about escape.
Right.
So it's a different, and you would even experience this, like, if you've ever been with somebody that's not fully there, or, it's a completely different experience than when you're connected in intention. Right? Like, so when you're coming in, this is something that's beautiful about Tantra. It's yoga. It's about consciousness. It's about coming in with, doing the breath work or the eye gazing. What brings us into our bodies before we come into connection, right? So we're coming into our own bodies before we come into union with each other. Right.
And we have a show plan for the Tantra to talk about that and exactly what that is, because now you piqued my curiosity again, and I've been getting up to speed on things, but that's definitely something we're going to be talking about. So what and we talked about the traumatized, like the whole being wired. Our bodies are wired for pleasure. So it as part of our journey in life, we should be exploring this, and what we're trying to do is break down so that you feel like you can and don't feel like you can't, right? Because that's when you hold back and you're not experiencing life to the fullest, which is what we want.
Yes. So, pleasure facilitates the rewiring of our traumatized pathways. So, a simple exercise that we'll close off with, if people want to kind of tune into on their own time, or just like when you think of a pleasurable experience, and something that felt really good and that brought you a lot of joy, and just notice, like, okay, like when you're thinking about that right now, what's happening in your body?
There's excitement. There's, you're lighter. You feel lighter.
Like you're probably more relaxed in the nervous system. You might be smiling just thinking about it. There's a opening just for receiving just that from a thought. And then when you think of a bad experience you've had, and you really like let it, come to the forefront, and you notice what, like right now, if I'm thinking of something bad, like I contract, I'm tight, my jaw feels pursed a little bit. So so you just know, so here's the example, like you're in contraction. So the whole thing that you constantly want to be training your bodies, how to soften, how to relax, because the more you train your body to relax, you're able to receive more. You're able to step into life from a more aware, connected space. You're not in reaction. You're not just in, response, which allows you not to feel. Then you're numb, you check out, you're looking for the quick fixes. So all these things are so subtle, but they're going to fuel poison or they're going to fuel medicine.
Well, that's wonderful. So we're gonna close on that. And that's our launch episode, and that's just a little bit of what we've got planned. The one thing I do want to clarify are these shows are monthly. And based on your demand, we can make them more. But for now, they will be monthly. And there's at 7 a.m. start in those months. So our next one will be April. And so look out for us. If you haven't joined the live, then you can catch it on replay. It'll be also part of the podcast to present it to the podcast. Any parting words, Theano, before we wrap up? We have the offer. Can you give about the offer? I didn't forget.
Actually, there's two things I'd like to invite the audience.
Oh, excellent.
One is there any topics that they can,
absolutely
write into that they'd like to hear more about. So,
just send them in on the comments against the shows there. We have streamed to Facebook, YouTube, as well as Twitch. So all those platforms have the ability to send your comments. We look for them, we act on them, we respond to them. So by all means, submit your comments there. If you want to reach out to us directly about show topics, then please send to social at icanworld.com, and you will be able to, we'll pick those up and make sure they factor into our programming. So once again, that's social at icanworld.com. In terms of the offer, I'm going to let Theano tell you about our offer for you. And also after the broadcast, we also will post it up, the offer, so that you can even take down the notes if you didn't get them. So go ahead, Theano.
Well, I'm just in first week of May, I'm going to launch a 6-week course on the pleasure prescription, and that's unlocking your pleasure potential. So some foundational pieces. So if that's something that interests you, you can email me at the devotion, DEVOTION at thetheano.com. And I don't know if you'll post that in the
It is going to be posted. I do have a thing about that offer. So please take advantage, reach out. And once again, repeat the address. Sometimes you got to do more than once.
Devotion at thetheano.com. So it's DEVOTION at THETHEAN as in Nancy O.com. So
perfect. And as I said, after the broadcast, just wait, we'll post about the offer, and it'll be out on social media as well. We do have some stuff we'll push out to social media to let you know about the offer. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and look forward for you joining us once a month at 7 a.m. Morning Reflections. So our first edition of Connect to Thrive Morning Reflections. Thank you, Theano, and we will go out.